Okay, all right, let's kick off. I think we're at about time. So welcome everybody to today's webinar. This is all about brand investment. Before we kick off and get to the main part of today's webinar, just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Rebecca Rosborough. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer here at Frontify, and I have some fantastic experts today, and we're going to be discussing one of my favorite topics, why brand matters. Now, some of the world's biggest brands were built during very difficult economic times. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of their success actually lies in the investment that they made into their brand. And as we all know today, the world is facing some very challenging times, and brands are facing some pretty uncertain times ahead of them. Now, we found that, and we'll talk about this in a bit here, but CMOs over the last 6 months have actually found that the last 6 months harder than navigating the pandemic. But despite all of these challenges, we have found in a recent survey that CMOs are still choosing to invest in brand building initiatives. And as I mentioned our survey a couple of times, but we did do a recent survey with about 450 CMOs across the US, the UK, and the DACH region. And that was one of the key findings, that despite these challenges, despite these economic challenges that we're currently facing, that they are still looking to invest in brand, which is great, hopefully for everybody on today's webinar. But this discovery, it does conflict, right, with the common assumption that companies fixate on the short-term results, right, when budgets are tight. And typically, I think that assumption means that brand building efforts are often put onto the back burner. So that's ultimately what we're going to be discussing today. We've got, as I mentioned, some fantastic brand experts from Landor Fitch. We've got Oxford University Press and Magic Numbers and Magic Works today. And ultimately, we're going to be covering 4 main topics. So why brands should be the focus in companies, for companies, why all stakeholders must and should get behind brand, what the different types of brand investment strategies look like. And we're going to talk a little bit about KPIs as well, and how you can measure the success of these strategies. Now, before I get again into asking the speakers to introduce themselves, a couple of housekeeping points. Everybody in the audience, you are in listen mode only. But if you have any questions, there is a Q&A panel in the menu bar. Feel free at any point to ask your questions, and then we'll try and get through as many of those at the end. We've got about 15 minutes for questions. And then the webinar is also going to be recorded, and we will share the recording as well for everybody that has registered. So you will receive an email shortly after today's webinar. Okay, that's enough for me and the intro. I'm going to now ask our speakers just to do a brief introduction. So Grace, you are on my screen, so I'm going to ask you to just introduce yourself first, if you will.
Yep. Hi, everyone. I'm Grace Kite. I'm the founder of 2 businesses that help marketers drive growth for their business. One is Magic Numbers, that provides people-friendly analytics, and the other is Magic Works, that provides practical training. And I'm a big advocate for brand. I love measuring it and seeing it working.
Thanks, Grace. Victoria.
Thanks, Rebecca. Hi, everybody. I'm the Senior Brand Manager at Oxford University Press. I'm sure it's an organisation that you'll have heard of. It's one of the biggest university presses in the world, and it's 500 years old. So what I'm doing is looking after that corporate brand for Oxford, which is a heritage brand which has sort of thousands of new titles coming out every single year in education and research, and also over 5,000 people working for us. So a lot of what I do is looking after sort of internal brand management, engagement, and advocacy on that side, as well as that external brand experience. So things like managing our sort of global website to be our sort of like shop front of Oxford, brand building content, making touch points consistent, and also bringing along other people in our organisation to invest in brand and really see the value of that long-term strategic plan.
Great. Thank you, Victoria. Looking forward to hearing some of your thoughts. Last but not least, David.
Thank you, Rebecca. Delighted to be here. Thank you for the invite. So I'm David Powell. I'm our Executive Global Practice Lead for our brand performance team within Landor, which is the world's largest brand transformation agency. And my job is to help brands to understand the business impact of what they do and help them build business cases to invest behind those brands.
Great. Okay, thank you. So we've got some, I think, really varied, hopefully some varied viewpoints here, and this will be a good discussion. We had a quick conversation 10 minutes before, and we already got into some really interesting points. So I'm sure it's going to be quite a good next 45 minutes or so. All right, let's kickstart. So I think there's two things at play. I'm going to start with a big question, just as a to give everybody a warning here. There's two things at play, right? I think we've got evolving consumer expectations on one side, and then we've got this challenging economic conditions and environment on the other side. And thinking about these two really big forces at play here, we know that brands need to navigate these challenging times, right? And so my big question, and I'm going to start, David, with you on this one. How can businesses balance brand and performance marketing? And should one be prioritized than the other? So I told you this is a big question, but I think that will hopefully get the juices flowing. So David, you obviously work with a lot of different clients. So I'd love to kind of get your perspective on that and your client's perspective as well.
Thank you, Rebecca. So, I mean, it is the big question of the moment for a lot of clients, and there's two ways to answer it. The kind of there's a way that sounds clever on a webinar but isn't actually very useful, which is that fundamentally, actually, they're not necessarily in competition with each other. Which is a great thing to say, but doesn't actually help you to make decisions when people are asking you to assign budgets. So the more practical way to think about it is that it's very much a nuance based on where you are in your business life cycle. So performance marketing is hugely important when you're driving sales generation, you're driving that revenue curve, and you've got that particular focus. But if you do that without the brand component, you're going to sacrifice your long-term growth potential, you're going to sacrifice the long-term loyalty of talent and customers, and you're going to sacrifice your price premium. Because ultimately, performance marketing is great for driving people through the funnel. But if you want to maintain the full health of that funnel, and you ultimately want to maintain those strong relationships throughout the funnel, you need to have that brand component. So there's always a balance depending on where you are in your business life cycle, what your category looks like. There's all kinds of factors you need to take into account. But if you get obsessed with one way or the other, you are ultimately going to deliver lower value and lower return over the long term.
Yeah, thanks, David. I've got a follow-up question to that. But Victoria, how do you see that at Oxford University Press? The kind of that, between how much you focus on brand, and I know that's something, obviously you're the senior brand manager there at Oxford Press, but how do you manage that and performance marketing? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, I guess I'm slightly biased as well, being the brand manager for Oxford. But I completely agree with David's point that I just don't think that the journey for decision makers is a linear journey, like between consideration to purchase through to retention. Like all of us, even as decision makers in our lives, know that is not something that is simple, and there are so many factors at play in those decisions that you make, and so many pressures on that. I think it's really crucial that every single time that you interact with your audiences, it has to be value adding. We are living in a world that, whether that's B2B or B2C, where we are so time poor and inundated with a lot of people offering very similar solutions to things. So to reinforce your brand promise and your positioning, to be the market lead and sort of like cut through that noise from other people, there has to be that balance in those two things. And I think another interesting thing is that last week I was at a talk from the CMO of On the Beach, which is a sort of holiday package company, and she joined during COVID, which is a time where they did not have any holidays to sell. And so she spoke about, with their brand, how they just reframed those commercial objectives. And it doesn't mean that they had to be sort of short-term wins for performance marketing, but actually they refocused on things like share of voice, spontaneous brand awareness, and really looked at those quick wins they could make to come out stronger out the back of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I thought that was a really good example of how, they both brand marketing and performance marketing both have a place, to David's point, in sort of like building that awareness and that consideration.
Yeah, thanks, Victoria. Sorry, Grace, you go.
I was going to go to an interesting example, because one of the things that I would maybe say is that a lot does depend, particularly in the current economic environment, as to whether people are actually buying your stuff at the moment. And hats off to On the Beach. They did do brilliant brand marketing during COVID, but I would say that there are some sectors at the moment that are really suffering because of the cost of living crisis, and actually maybe spending a lot of money on brand is maybe not the right thing if you're in a category that people are not really buying at the moment because they're struggling to pay the rent and things. So I think it does depend as well on life stage, on a whole range of things, but also on what the outside world wants to buy from your category at the moment. And there is a case for sometimes just retrenching and doing the things that you need to do to capture the sales that are coming your way anyway, with performance, for example, and not doing big investments when your category is in trouble.
Yeah, and Grace, one thing I was going to ask you, it's maybe slightly aside of what you just said there, but I think sort of have you or have any of your clients sort of created and connected kind of that brand positioning with activation metrics? Because I think that's also something that, again, I've talked a lot about in the past around how you can kind of connect the brand piece with actually performance activation metrics and to tell a story. Is that something you've seen, you've done?
I think it's something that you've got to do. I mean, I've got a friend who's in performance marketing, and he says, look, you wouldn't pour water into a funnel that had a hole at the bottom, would you? And it's right. And if you haven't got the performance marketing straight to capture the bottom of the funnel, then you'll waste water or branding pouring it into the top of the funnel. So I think you have to do both. And I think you have to have metrics that allow you to see how the two things work together. And that's something that we work with a lot with our clients. For example, if you go on TV, what does that do to your ability to buy well in the search bidding algorithms? And it does improve your chances of having a good ad rating and a good CPC and high position on the page if you're doing brand marketing. So the two things really do work together, and you can see it in econometrics, which is what is our bread and butter. And I think, David said you've got to think about them both and you've got to have both. It sounds good in a webinar. I think it does. And it also works well if you can measure both those things and see the interaction too, as something that you can actually optimize the two things together.
And Victoria, is that, I mean, I guess from your perspective at Oxford, do you, when you're thinking about measurement, we're going to talk about KPIs, I think, a bit later on, but when you're thinking about measurement, is that something that you try and do, is connect those two different parts of the funnel and the brand and the activation? And how do you, without getting too much into the KPIs, because you will talk about how do you do that?
Yeah, totally. So we are a large organization with a huge portfolio of products and services. And so absolutely kind of like echoing what Grace says there, where we are sort of like communicating and putting out brand marketing to reach those audiences at the top of the funnel, we also work really, really closely with our product marketing teams to make sure that that journey is joined up, and that we're able to sort of like capture all of those people at wherever they are in their decision-making process. So I have to say, and what I'm going to say a bit later about measurement is it is quite difficult, and particularly for an organisation like ours, which is completely global and has a complete spread of audiences, like from educators through to researchers through to like sort of like leaders of big institutions. All of those people have very different needs and sort of want very different things from Oxford as well. So it's difficult to track those people, but you just have to look at every single touch point where they are interacting with you and ensure that brand experience is as consistent as possible and really reinforcing, like I say, like that brand promise across every single one of those interactions.
Great, thanks, Victoria. We're going to move a little bit now into a slightly different topic after that big opener. So thank you for your thoughts. So I mentioned the survey that we had we're just about to deliver actually. And in that survey, it was really interesting actually for me specifically, because a lot of the CMOs in that survey actually mentioned that they would like to, if they haven't already, they would like to hire a chief brand officer in their business. And I wanted to ask David, one, is this something you're seeing with your clients? Are you seeing more and more of these types of roles, this chief brand officer kind of cropping up? And what do you think about that? Have you had any experiences specifically working with chief brand officer, and what do they bring to the table, would you say?
So the nomenclature of where brand sits in organizations is fascinating. So you'll see some organizations, particularly you tend to see it in more US centric kind of hardcore B2B audiences, where actually brand is a kind of VP role and it reports into corporate relations. It doesn't even report to marketing, kind of sits with an IR or a corporate relations focus. And then you'll see kind of your FMCG businesses, obviously brand responsibility sits quite low down in the organization at the brand manager level. And then it embeds and it goes all the way up through a marketing chain. You may even have a chief brand officer at the top. So you'll have some very brand-centric organizations that have multiple brand roles that will go across those levels, and some where brand, there's only one person with a job title in a business with doing $60 billion in turnover, and they've got one person with responsibility for brand. So you see that real spectrum. I think.
Which one's the one that succeeds, David, do you reckon?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things I'll come to throughout is brand plays a very different role depending on what category you're in. There are some decisions that are hugely brand driven, luxury goods, for example, where we do see a lot of chief brand officers. And then if you're in commodity production of paper, actually that's not a particularly brand driven purchase decision. So those organizations focus less on brand, and then the brand role is less important potentially than an IR role might be for them. The one that's interesting where I'm seeing chief brand officers really start to play a role is more in those service-centric businesses where you've got that need to blend all the elements of brand. So you've got to need to blend the communications aspect, the experience aspect, and the product aspect, and pull all of those together through a brand lens. And that's where a chief brand officer really helps to connect it across, because historically, if you funnel brand under a communications lens, you miss out on that experience perspective. If you funnel it through too much of a product or chief customer officer or chief sales officer lens, you miss maybe some of that communications. So those are the organizations that I think are really doing it well, when they're starting to connect that sense of communications, experience, and product and align that all through brand. That's where it can make it really powerful.
I do agree with you on that, David. However, I also think that having a person that either sits on the C-suite or kind of is that contact in an organization kind of puts the onus on them for those who are making those decisions, whereas your brand is literally your business vision and should belong to every single person. And I think it should be built from the top down, but also from the grassroots up. So we've rebranded our corporate brand in 2021, and that was a huge feat for us. Like, it was the first time in decades that we'd really thought about our global brand strategy and where we were going to be in 500 years time in the future, not just 500 years ago. And
cool.
it was so intrinsic that every single one of our leaders was part of that decision, contributing to it, and really bought into it, and we're advocating for it as well, because it saw effects across every part of our business. So my only kind of challenge to that is that if you do have like a chief brand officer that's sort of sitting and making those decisions and is responsible for that, does that stop your other leaders in other functions taking the same amount of responsibility?
Victoria, quick question on that. So you talked about this big rebrand, and I know when you and I met a couple of months ago, you mentioned it as well. Where did that come from? Was that kind of the CEO who said, okay, we need to think about doing some sort of rebrand? Where did that start?
Yeah, so it was, I know that it was a sort of very sort of long-term plan, and it was a really difficult piece of work to get over the line. And my manager, who's the head of brand and digital communications, absolutely, it was her baby, and she really sort of like pushed that through from the conception of the idea. And it was something that was identified through research and through voice of the customer work for years and years. And then actually the biggest challenge was then making sure that all of those people, from our chief exec through to our managers, were on board with why this had to happen now, because it's a sort of decision that is so long term and such a big investment that you could keep putting it off. And as it happened, just completely coincidentally, that piece of work then coincided with the COVID pandemic, where we saw a huge shift to digital for education and research. And we saw how there were competitors in our market and sort of like incoming people who were actually making us be at risk of being an incumbent, because the sort of world around us was changing so quickly. So those two things actually sort of worked well at the same time. Of course, there were challenges as well, and with the pandemic and sort of like real scrutiny of investment and how a business was sort of trying to maintain and sort of like sustain themselves. But it was a really sort of like piece of like good timing that we were able to reposition ourselves and really look critically at how we were presenting ourselves to all of our different audiences. So yeah, it was a big feat, I have to say, and it's still happening now, right? That we're a not-for-profit organisation, so that has to be a sustainable implementation. You can't sort of spend all of your money and sort of like do this huge refresh of your identity and all of your assets. We also print a lot as well, and obviously we're going to be sort of working with that heritage brand for a long time. So yeah, that's still going ahead, and it's important that that is incremental, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the internal part of a rebrand is often something that goes a bit underestimated about how heavy a lift that is. There's obviously the external piece of a rebrand, right, and everything and the repositioning, but internally to get everyone behind that is not easy, especially in a company, you know, as big as yours, a non-profit as big as yours. And Grace, I wanted to ask you the same question about sort of your experience with chief brand officers. Because it's really is fair to say that we have seen an uptick in, I think the last stat I read was 83% of companies, again, that we had spoken to actually had hired a chief brand officer in the last couple of years, which is massive.
That's a lot, yeah.
So have you seen a similar trend with your clients, and what's been your experience with that role?
I mean, I think I'm in line with really what David was saying about it's such a big thing, the brand, and it's you know, you communicate the tip of the iceberg, and the iceberg is massive. It's got to go across everything that the business is doing. So having someone right at the very top of the organization that can drive that forward and be responsible for it is right. And I don't know whether you call them a chief brand officer or it's just the CMO's job or whatever, but I think, you know, it should have representation at the top of organizations, particularly in B2C. I think as well, what I've seen in big companies when there is brand at the top table, you do see long-term growth. I think that is something that does happen. But what I've also seen that's quite interesting is we've got quite a lot of e-commerce businesses in our client base, and something happens when they reach a certain age, and you know, we were saying that performance first is right when you're an early life stage, but at some point you're going to turn into a business that needs to do brand as well. And at that point in the life stage, quite often somebody comes in to e-commerce and maybe they've got a background in FMCG or financial services or something, so they know about brand building, and they come into an e-commerce business, and that person has a remit to change things, and has you know, can have a massive impact, but it's actually quite a tricky gig for that incoming person, because you're coming into an organization that's like very performance first, that's kind of used to doing everything with data now, you know, and it can be quite a tricky gig. So hats off to some CMOs who do it really well, or chief brand officers that do it really well. I've seen it not work out in a couple of occasions as well.
And I guess, David, a question to you, because you work obviously with many different types of clients. We were talking about this earlier. Have you seen any sort of best practices or tips for people that are listening today around how you can get more stakeholders involved in brand in general, and especially around repositioning and rebrands of these big moments? But have you sort of seen, you know, or have you got any best practices, I guess, you can share with us?
I think Victoria's right. Like, engagement is absolutely key. So probably, I mean, I won't say favorite client, because it's very dangerous to have a favorite client. But one client I do really love working with is Vattenfall. So Vattenfall, their CEO Anna Borg, is really committed to brand, to the extent that when she presents to her executive committee, she will actually use their brand purpose, the core essence of their brand, which for years has been delivering fossil-free living within one generation. So obviously in the energy generation business, she'll use that as a framework for decisions they make at the executive leadership table, even decisions that aren't directly related to comms or experience or brand, but it's a framework for actually how they talk about what they do as a business. And when you've got a senior client like that, actually making the brand really sing within an organization is relatively straightforward, because you've got that commitment and bringing it in. So I think, to echo what Victoria said, if you can get the entirety of the C-suite committed to how brand plays a role within the organization, and then embed that through all of the ways they work and feed that down through their teams, then you've got an organization that not only has got a more powerful brand that's going to help them over the long term in terms of growth, but also is going to drive more consistency in all of their decision making. So increasingly now, brands, they have visions, they have purposes. And those purposes are designed to help the organization be coherent and consistent, not just the brand be consistent.
I think that's a really interesting point. And just to add to that, I think not only is brand purpose so important, but also ensuring that those customers are at the heart of the strategy, and every single piece of decision making centers around those people. Because as long as you're always taking that step back and thinking like, actually, what is this going to mean? That ultimately is going to drive profit and it's going to lead to success. I also think, like, I think you're right with that, David. And I think that data-driven curiosity is really important. I think brand has a really, really intrinsic role in pushing boundaries and challenging the norm and really like getting the business to think about that future vision. But to translate that and get that engagement from people who might not be so brand literate, it's all about the data. And like I said before, I sort of come from the side in-house where I think that is quite difficult to measure without a lot of investment, but it is really important so that you can get that buy-in and everyone kind of understands that, okay, like there is short-term wins from performance marketing, but then there's that long-term consideration piece that, yeah, like we said before, is just as valuable.
Yeah, and I guess, Victoria, just staying with you for a second, because I wanted to, we sort of touched a little bit on brand investment strategies, sort of at large, but I'd love to kind of understand a bit more around what does that look like? What does brand investment strategy look like for you at Oxford University Press?
Yeah, sure.
So, any examples to sort of share, that would be great.
Yeah, of course. So as I mentioned, that sort of like incremental implementation of our global brand strategy is still ongoing. That is a fantastic blank canvas for us to work with, but we have a lot of touch points that is taking time. So we need to do that sustainably. We're also really fortunate to win investment around our brand guidelines and like partnering with Frontify actually on that, and that made a huge difference to that sort of internal brand management and engagement and sort of getting it out to our 5,000 plus people and how they're working with the brand. So that is really important to us and will continue to be really important to us. We've been able to really demonstrate the impact of having a sort of like platform and tools like that. I think the other thing is investment for us is not always financial. So I sit within our group communications team, and I think it's interesting in what David said about the sort of the different structures that you can see. We feel that we're really at the heart of the organisation and really connecting all of the brilliant things that are going on across Oxford and sort of like sharing those out to our global audiences. But that team, because we are a not-for-profit organisation, like we do a lot with a little, and there is so much power in thought leadership and community brand building, and just really looking at amplifying the things that are going on. So keep an eye out for a very exciting Word of the Year campaign that's coming up from us shortly. A little plug. And I think also that our brand investment strategy and sort of like long term is looking at measurement and keeping to conduct that research and reflecting on our positioning and sort of like where we are on that journey for our brand strategy, and also, like I mentioned, like just giving the guidelines to people to empower them for the people that maybe do have that financial budget. So looking at sort of like our marketing and sales functions, how we can best work with them to make sure that brand marketing is part of their bread and butter and what they're doing. And also for some of our customers, their only touch point will be one of our sales representatives in a market, for instance. So actually, what is that brand experience for those people, whether it's sort of like on our online touch points or those people who are interacting with just one employee at AUP. So yeah, it's quite varied, but definitely not just financial investment. Like I think it's all about stakeholder engagement and getting that buy-in and sort of like cultural changes as well in brand.
And I think just I guess that's a really good point there. And David, I'm interested from your perspective and again from your clients that you work with, when we're talking about, brand investment strategies, do you find that it does differ based on, industry, nature of the customer, whether it's a heritage brand or a new brand? Have you seen those sort of, I guess, the nature of that being quite different in how they look at investing in brand?
Well, hugely different. I mean, to give you a bit of context, so we, as part of WPP, we run brand asset value studies, 60,000 brands we tracked for 30 years, the world's kind of biggest, longest standing brand study. One of the things we can do with that is look at what is the role of branding category. So how influential is brand in driving purchase decisions across different categories? And you'll see some categories, classically sort of heavy B2B commodity industries, like buying sheets of paper. The role of brand might be 3-4% of the decision. It's mainly driven by price and convenience. It's not a brand driven category. Whereas you get to luxury goods, or typically your classic really high margin categories, 95% of the reason you're buying a particular bag might be the brand that sits behind that bag. So you've got hugely different dynamics within those contexts. You add to that very different purchase cycles, very different kind of sales amounts. Typically, if you've got long purchase cycle, multi-million-dollar purchases, that's going to be more brand driven than it's going to be performance driven. What's the role of human beings in the sales cycle? I mean, do you have Victoria talked about the importance of putting brand through your people. If you've got a large sales organization, or actually some of the consulting businesses, for example, something like an Accenture or a PwC, the brand really manifests through their people more than it does through their communications. Now, your perception of the Accenture brand is largely driven by who you interact with at Accenture, more so than it is the comms piece. So you have these very different dynamics depending on the category you operate in. And I'm sure Grace will talk about it more, but also, how mature you are as a business. Grace touched upon it already. That life cycle you're in and the efficiency curves for brand and for performance marketing, they're slightly different over time, and they decay in slightly different ways. And the interaction between those two decay curves and how you can use brand to accelerate the performance marketing at different points, that also has a real impact on how you want to balance that level of investment.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess, I mean, David, the other thing that we briefly talked about earlier was also just from a global perspective, right? Because obviously if you're sitting on the top of a global brand, and you've got to think about what does that look like in the APAC region? What does that look like in the US? And you talked a bit about that as well, which is again could be quite a different play as well. But Grace, just to kind of go over to you specifically, and kind of touching on some of those points. I mean, this is a lot to navigate, right? I mean, to kind of understand all of these different nuances. So do you have any kind of, again, I'm going to ask the best practice question, but do you have any best practices, or I guess any advice on how do we establish, how do you go about establishing a brand strategy investment piece? Because I think there's just so much to think about.
Yeah, and that's right. There is a lot to think about. And look, I mean, I believe that measurement is a really, really important part of the puzzle here. And that can be before you start on your brand building. So you might do something like a campaign in one region where you spend as much as you would spend in that region if it was a national campaign, but not do the rest of the country, and do something like a test to see what the uplift from that was. And that can be a first step into brand building, and you can get a read on how it's going to work. The second thing you can do is, instead of, say you're thinking about a TV campaign for your brand building, you could go to YouTube first and try different things on YouTube, and see how, and get a read on how that's working. So there are some sort of tentative steps that people can take to get some confidence that it's going to work and get some measurement and some feedback before scaling up in the way that actually you probably do need to do to get the most out of your brand building is to go big with it. And that's I know quite a few businesses that have gone through that route, and they've taken the steps bit by bit, and they've convinced their CFOs and their investors that this is the right thing to do that way, and been able to then scale up and do brand building in a much bigger way. But equally, I know a range of businesses who are brave enough to just make a leap, and it is always a little bit of a leap with brand building, because you've got your brand positioning, and you've got your all that strategic piece that we've been talking about done, but you have to then take it to market, and there's always going to be a bit of a leap with it. And some organizations are comfortable just doing that, usually where they've got an experienced CMO or CBO, as we've been talking about, in there at the helm. And then it becomes a matter of evaluating afterwards. But the one tip I would really give when it comes to measurement, particularly around brand building, is to really think about the actual stakeholders who have to sign off on it or have to agree to continue with it. And when I say the actual stakeholders, I don't mean like what their job title is. I mean, Rob, the CFO, or Jenny, the CMO, like and though I've made those names up, but the real people and what they care about and what their motivations are, what they're trying to do with their career, what vision they've got for the business. Because sometimes it's a CFO who wants a test and learn strategy, wants to see some evidence coming back before he can sign off on a bigger deal. But sometimes it's somebody who needs to know, who needs to have a story as to why we haven't done it already if it's so good. Like, say you're the CMO, you need to have that story in your back pocket before you can take it to the CEO. And actually, if the investors just want this to be the next, platform, they want to be the next Amazon, say that's what they aspire to, you take them the case study that shows that Amazon does this, and those are the kinds of evidence that actually get brand building off the ground, in my experience. So that's the top tip from me, is consider the real people involved.
I think also something that you can really learn from that, and I find it really, really useful in my role, is looking out of sector and those best practices, like you say, that are sort of happening. And it doesn't have to be too ambitious. Like, not everyone has the $1 million budget, but there are definitely learnings that you can take from outside of your sector. And again, I think, in my opinion, like, that is a really important and valuable role of brand experts who are working in-house, is to be like looking at those trends and looking at those case studies and bringing those into their decision making. So yeah, totally agree.
I think that's a great point, Victoria, because I think it's very easy to kind of look within your own industry, and that's why there's a lot of sameness, actually, right? You see often, and I think if you can look outside and take inspiration and adapt that to what makes sense for your industry, your business, I think that's where some of the biggest success from branding comes to play. But so we've talked a lot about we've talked a bit about sort of establishing that, but I guess on the sort of the flip side of that, are there sort of no-go areas where brands really just shouldn't touch when it comes to rolling out brand investment strategies? I don't know if anybody's got any examples or had an experience of that, but there's obviously a lot of things that we need to think about, but yeah, what are the no-go areas? What are the things that we should be either just aware of or avoid? And David, I don't know if you've got any sort of perspective on that.
Well, so specifically, if you're changing too much stuff around brand, I also, my cardinal rule, it's an aphorism from our chief strategy officer, Thomas O'Donnell, never let the front end get too far in front of the back end. So he says, don't let your brand get ahead of your operational reality. By which he means that if you're integrating two businesses, particularly two consumer businesses, and you're bringing them together and saying, we're now one entity, if your back-end database and your customer management systems don't support that, to the extent that heritage customers are having different experiences across both parts of your organization, don't go out and claim that you've got a big brand investments to launch a singular brand strategy. So I think that's always my first caution to any client looking at a big brand investment is, do you have the operational reality to back up what you're about to communicate from a brand perspective? Because brand changes, rebrands, new names, new vision, they're all fantastic, but they're a moment in time that gives you that reappraisal. And if that reappraisal falls flat, you're better off waiting and not wasting that money.
Yeah, I think that's a great. I love that quote. I actually wrote that down. I scribbled that down when you mentioned that. Good. Okay. Well, let's move on to probably a favorite topic of some people, but KPIs. And Victoria, because you obviously you've been talking a little bit about the rebrand, the repositioning that you went through very, very recently. Actually, I'd love to kind of get a bit more into the KPI part of that, and what were you measuring, and not only what are you sort of looking at measurement from a brand perspective, but obviously thinking about this repositioning and this rebrand that you guys have recently done. How are you measuring the success of that?
Sure. And I think it's worth absolutely starting with the sort of like refresh of our brand identity, and like the launch of our global brand strategy was absolutely changing our identity and our toolkit of assets and sort of the way we looked and also the way we spoke, but also going much more towards a master branded architecture and really changing how our business approached brand and making really good decisions, because we'd had decades and 500 years worth of expanding our portfolio and not sort of making sort of strategic decisions on how to keep that that contains. So there's kind of like two things at play there in terms of what you're measuring, and like a variation of how easy it is for us to do that. Like at the end of the day, if you're trying to measure how your portfolio is working, that is how your business is performing over like a certain amount of years, and there's so many things at play there. But in terms of our actual brand strategy, we have a really clear set of sort of targets and benchmarks that we're working towards and sort of testing against our audiences. So that's things like spontaneous recall, market resonance, loyalty and retention. Obviously, Oxford is a brand that institutions work with for years and years and years, and that retention and that advocacy and measuring our NPS is really, really crucial to us. And measuring against sort of very particular positioning and strategic aspirations that we have, and making sure that we're sort of like keeping those at front and center of every kind of like decision that we're making and all of our communications. We're also looking at share of voice and sort of that awareness piece, and I have some expert colleagues who work in PR and social media and are really looking at what are kind of like, through social listening, like what people are saying about us and what they are thinking about us. So that's really important. And then on a more short-term basis, it's looking at, we're quite a campaign-based team as well, which is really exciting. So looking at campaign and channel measuring and like looking at every single one of those touch points and building the picture, internal and external, of what people are thinking about us and sort of like what their perception of us is. And then I think inevitably it's quite difficult to, like, that long-term vision is really helpful to know, but inevitably that has to lead to conversion. So it's just then working with our marketing colleagues and building that picture. We have hundreds of marketers across OUP, so sort of having that global picture across them and what their voice of the customer research is telling us as well. So it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour.
No, thank you. And I have to ask, like, how has it been since you did the repositioning? I mean, are you happy with it?
Yeah, do you know what, we are just over the moon, because there are some fantastic things. Like, we have such a fantastic connection to the University of Oxford, and we have such a like prestigious history, but also we're now able to be like, I don't think you can underestimate the power of a brand strategy in actually, I mean, agree with David's point that you can't go too far ahead and not be able to back up with that consistent experience, but being able to sort of like push the business in a direction for the future. So for us to be far more future focused and cutting edge and sort of like looking at brand partnerships that are sort of really exciting for us that we weren't doing 5 to 10 years ago. So that's been really exciting, and almost feels like our brand strategy has unlocked that potential for us. And I think also like sort of working with our colleagues and our people, I do a lot of sort of training and education for them, and seeing them, like, the enthusiasm was there and they wanted to work with the Oxford brand, but seeing them now have the tools to do that, we're just seeing some excellent things that are sort of coming out of those teams. So yeah, we're really, really happy, and it's been a big piece of work, and like 2 years of our lives that felt like a lifetime, but yeah, it's great to see those sort of benefits.
Yeah, that's great news. Well, congratulations. So I know what a big lift that is, especially with a quite an iconic brand like you have. So so that's great to hear that it's going really well internally as well as externally. And I guess, Grace, same sort of quick question to you around the KPIs. I mean, again, when you're sort of advising your clients, what's in the toolkit from a KPI perspective? Like, what are the really, really important metrics that you advise your clients to be really focused on?
Yeah, so you can't go wrong with the traditional things like go out and ask people, have you heard of this brand? Would you consider it? Would you recommend it? Those old chestnuts are still, really, really valuable and important. I also am of the belief that you can measure the effect of brand building and brand growth on sales, and that you should do. There's no excuse nowadays for going, oh, brand's this ethereal thing where we do it and we hope it works and we don't then measure whether that paid back or not. There's no excuse for that anymore, and I am not a believer on people who go, well, ROI it's not a perfect measure, it's got these issues, therefore, you know, we shouldn't have to worry about it. I'm dead against that, and I think nowadays with econometrics and other methods, you know, you can see the effect of brand building on sales, and those kind of techniques have got much more accessible, much faster, much better as technology has come into the measurement space. And so companies like us at Magic Numbers and others are turning those projects around quickly, and estimate and giving good reads on what the long-term effect of different brand building activities are. So for me, you know, show me the money.
And David, what about you and your clients? Again, is there sort of what are the key metrics that you, or the KPIs that you advise customers, your clients, to really focus on?
So, I mean, we always go back to a quote from our founder, from Walter Landor, who said, kind of, products are built in the factory, but brands are built in the mind. And it's useful to remind clients that what you write down as your brand on a piece of paper is your vision for what you want your brand to be, not what your brand is. What your brand is how that brand is showing up in the minds of all your key audiences, in your talent, in your employees, in your customers, and your clients. So understanding what that brand actually is fundamental to that. And we talk about that in two perspectives. So we talk about the fundamental brand equity, which is exactly what Grace, how is brand contributing to your sales? And there's a number of techniques to do that, and they're very category specific typically, and they're tied into how you use your own data. And then what is the mental space you own for customers? So how are you actually distinctive from your competitors? What is the mental space and the mental territory that you own? Kind of, what are those associations that you have that you can leverage and grow on in the future? So we always talk about that, but it's that fundamental change of mindset to think your brand is a living thing that exists out in the world, and you are a guardian of that, and you can use tools like the tools at Frontify to help manage and guard that. But what you put out is not your brand. What lands in the minds of your audience, that is your brand, and that's what you need to protect and nurture and grow.
Right, thank you. Thanks, David. I think it's some really, really interesting perspectives there. And we've got about just over 10 minutes to go, and we have got a couple of questions. I do want to get to those questions, but just one thing we haven't touched on, and I wanted to ask each of you around technology, right, and embracing new technologies, because, you know, I don't want to be that webinar that talks again about AI as every other webinar is at the moment, but there are a lot of emerging technologies which marketers, brand folk, you know, in our world as well, designers are using in order to help create brands and to evolve brands and so forth. And so I just wanted to ask the question, you know, to each of you around, what are you seeing from sort of these emerging technologies, whether it be your customers, your clients? Victoria, from your perspective at Oxford, are you using any of these? I mean, obviously we work with some of you guys as well, and some of your clients, and so there are a lot of platforms like Frontify as well. But yeah, really interested in that kind of perspective. So David, you're on the screen. How are your customers, or how are you working with customers with these new emerging technologies, and obviously AI being probably the hot one at the moment?
Well, so AI and automation are there's no part of our organization that is not being touched by AI, and there's a whole team within WPP, and that Satalia, which has just joined the WPP family, is a dedicated AI business. I think for me the most interesting, the two examples I'll give you, the most interesting ones that we're playing with. One is synthetic customers. So actually building data based off of primary research, primary understanding of customers, complementing that with social. So you can actually start to create an AI facsimile of your customer base that you can then do rapid testing, and you can actually interrogate on an instantaneous basis. So that helps you to ultimately generate better insights, more creative ideas that then you can go and conventionally test, and you can put that through regular ethnography, but it's got a really rapid utilization. So one of the things AI is doing is it's speeding up a lot of the processes we do around innovation, insight, and design. The other aspect is more to do with brand governance and brand management. So there's a lot of AI tools that you can use now that help you to make that governance process a lot simpler and a lot smoother. We've had some clients who have had historically issues around legal compliance issues around how they use their brand and what they do, and contravening trademarks. And a lot of those tools that you implement on the back end from an AI perspective can also de-risk a lot of what you do and make sure you've got more consistency. They're not a replacement for a good brand manager, but ultimately they do provide a kind of an additional guiding hand, which I think is useful for brand teams and for local marketing teams.
Thanks. I hadn't heard of it. Was that synthetic audience?
Synthetic customers, yeah. So it's
okay. Haven't heard of that one before.
So
it's
cool.
a way of taking a panel and creating it in AI rather than creating real human beings. It's quite a new kind of AI technique we're using.
Okay, I'm gonna have to check that out. It's a new one for me, but okay, I will definitely research that one afterwards. Victoria, are you using, again, doesn't necessarily just have AI, but are you using any sort of emerging technologies, especially as part of, again, the rebrand that you've been going under the last couple of years?
Yeah, sure. I was going to say to you, it's probably the only industry talk in the past year that hasn't mentioned AI for 45 minutes. So I think we did well.
Sorry about that. I know. I had to put it in there.
It's inevitable and it's super exciting. I think for us at Oxford, like, there's kind of like 3 different parts to that, really. Like, obviously there's looking at sort of productivity tools, and in that way we're taking a really incremental approach because we are a really large organization, obviously part of the university, and we are just sort of like, we are also not for profit, like I keep saying, so like that has to be a sustainable and like considered approach to sort of like investing in new technologies, for sure. But that is exciting for our people. I think there's also looking at our product development, and there's some really exciting things going on, which again, like, that's for your brand vision and your brand strategy. Like, that sort of like long-term focus on the future of what that could be is super exciting, and sort of looking at different partnerships that we can sort of like take on in the future too. And then finally, I think for us, there's it's keeping our communities at the absolute heart of everything that we're doing. So obviously within education and research, AI is a whole different ballgame, and there are a lot of teachers who are sort of like concerned but also excited about the future of technology and how that will either assist them or what that will mean for their industries. And we have a really important role to play as like an authoritative source to those people in sort of like sharing that information and research. So for example, we just released a report called AI in Education, which contains some global research, and that's really looking at sort of like the impact of these tools and how educators are feeling and what the lay of the land is. So I would implore you to go and have a look at that, because it's really exciting. And also for us, you know, we work all around the world and almost every single country and region, and there is still a huge digital divide, and that's kind of only expanding because of the sort of like inequality in how technology is rolling out. So yes, we're looking ahead, and that's really exciting, but we also have a responsibility to those communities who are still working with paper and in print, and making sure that they have the right solutions. So yeah, it's a bit of both for us.
Yeah, it's a really good point, actually, Grace. Sorry, Victoria, that you make there. And Grace, anything from your side on emerging technologies that you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the analytics space, we're probably the early adopters of this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, at Magic Numbers, we're using AI to help us write our code and to check code for us, and helping us to automate our processes and things. But all of that's sort of very much in the back end, because we talked about brand positioning, and I guess the brand positioning for my business, analytics business, Magic Numbers, is that we are very people focused, and we want to support marketers. So we don't talk to our clients about AI, and we don't talk to them about whizzy tools, and we don't talk to them about kind of how smart the tools are or anything like that. We talk to them about, you know, what do you want to see happen in your business, and who needs to get on board for that, and what evidence do they need for that. And you know, we spend a lot of time with stakeholders and things like that, and that's something that can't be automated. That will never be anything other than a job for real people. So, you know, a bit of both, I guess. But I guess the warning thing in all of this is that, you know, brands in particular are, as David said, something that lives in people's minds, real people's minds, and so you can't hand off really the job of talking to real people to computers yet. They're just not good enough at that yet. So for us, it's in the back end rather than anything that's front and center for our clients.
Got it. And yeah, thank you guys for just that last quite random question from my side. But yeah, couldn't quite make the webinar without having to talk a little bit about AI. So hopefully that was just a small piece. But we only got 5 minutes left, and then we do have we have 3 questions actually. I'm gonna open up and go with actually the second one. Question. So I'll read it out and then hopefully get some perspective. It's a really interesting question. So question is, brand marketing seems to be a term that's gaining traction of late, but do you actually believe brand marketing exists, or are we just adding another term to the already complex world of brand and marketing? When we put out an ad, whether it's geared towards performance or not, it carries our brand and has an influence on someone's perception of it. I'd be super interested in your thoughts on this debate. So Grace, thoughts on that?
Yes, brand marketing does exist, would be my short answer to that one. You know, I was sat in an agency that mainly does performance marketing, and I'm not going to tell you which one it was of recent. And I heard one of the marketers go, "Oh, but we've got a rectangle here. We need to colour it in." You know, that is so different to where I sit sometimes in a brand marketing agency, where they're saying, what emotion do we want this person to feel? And those are really two very different kind of ways of going ways of going into marketing. And you know, there's also two very different mindsets. There's the mindset of, I'm shopping right now, and I want to buy something. And so if I'm doing that and I'm in that kind of mindset, I need to know, is it going to be in the right size? Is it going to be delivered in time? Can I get it in time for my son's birthday, for example? And that's a very different mindset for I'm not in market right now, but a message might reach me that could last until I am in the mindset to buy. So there are two very different ways of going about marketing for different mindsets of the customer. Different levels of consideration go into what happens in those ads, and they are really two different ways of working. And it's not to say that any one ad can't do both jobs. All ads probably do a bit of both, but in all honesty, there is something different about the two.
David, what about you? Does brand marketing exist?
I understand the sentiment behind the question, because I agree. There are certain aspects of your brand, your tone of voice, your visual guidelines that should come through no matter where you contact with the customer, whether that's a performance marketing piece or it's a brand-led piece. There are some things that should always be consistent and should be innately your brand. And if you have a strong brand, then however you show up, you should immediately be recognizable as that. So I think that's the sentiment of the question, which I do agree with. I would say they're great. Like when we talk to clients about client budget setting, often there is a budget for brand marketing, there is a budget for performance marketing, and they are distinctive and separate. So in that sense, they do exist because people are using them to do different jobs and do different outcomes, and they have different investments. They may well have different internal stakeholders who manage those two processes. So in a real world experience, they do exist. But I understand the sentiment behind the question that in theory, all of this marketing should be consistently on brand, and we shouldn't have to use terms like, well, this one's brand and that one's not. It should all be brand, but for internal budgeting purposes, it's useful to have a delineation between the two.
And then last couple of minutes before we wrap up, but Victoria, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point that about adding to the jargon, and I think brand professionals have a responsibility to play in sort of like translating what that means. I obviously agree with David that your brand should be felt through every single one of your communications. That is my job. But I do think that brand marketing is a real thing and is really, really important for organizations to be investing in. Like, I think now more than ever before, customers, end users and consumers and employees as well, they are looking for brand purpose and for organizations that align with their values. And that is just something that's hard to communicate when you're sort of like product marketing or doing something that's focused on like, please please buy what we're offering to you. And so brand marketing has a real place in sort of showing what your business's impact on the world is, and just making sure that you're sort of like aligning with those values. And I think it's just all about segmentation, right? Like, as we've sort of mentioned throughout this webinar, the sort of like your different audiences have different needs and they're at different points along the journey, and so there's a place for both of those things. But I think it's just going to become even more important, I think, as we go forward.
Great. That was a great place to end. There was a couple of questions actually, Victoria, for you in the chat, but maybe we'll try and see if we can get those answered directly.
Yeah, feel free to like direct message me on LinkedIn and stuff as well, because I'm happy to always chat about our refresh.
Yeah, you definitely had a couple more questions. So yeah, I think one was Rebecca from Stroke Association, and the other one was anonymous, but yeah, feel free to reach out to Victoria. But just wanted to say thank you to our speakers. I think it was a really interesting and a thought-provoking conversation, and thank you to everybody as well for joining the webinar today. I hope you found it equally as interesting, and as I mentioned at the beginning, we'll be sending around the recording to everybody that registered, so do look out for that email. But wishing you all a great day, a great rest of your week, and again, thank you to our speakers for dropping all their knowledge. So thank you very much. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye now.